An Examination of a Cerebral Narcissist, Part 4. For Christmas last year, Agnes and Arnold and the 3 children went to Pennsylvania to visit his family. Agnes couldn't stop coughing and sneezing. About a week earlier, she'd had a severe allergy attack brought on by a cat, and the symptoms hadn't subsided. One night she was making pita bread, coughing every few minutes, and Arnold was sitting at a table in the kitchen grading papers on his laptop. They were sharing the same space, but Agnes felt as if they were in 2 separate worlds: pretension, self-absorption. She was reminded of a line from the Icelandic novel Independent People by Halldór Laxness, which she had just read, Cerebral Approach. 2 human beings have such difficulty in understanding each other, there is nothing so tragical as 2 human beings. The next day, when I visited Agnes and Arnold at his parents' house, she told him that while making the pita, she had felt as if they were out of sync. She wished he had put down his laptop and talked to her. Threat to control. She was aware that something more purposeful could be happening, and the lack felt tragic. Pretension, cerebral approach. He's not paying attention to what I want him to pay attention to, she said of that moment. Threat to control. He's not interested in what I want him to be interested in. Assertion of control and threat to control. She recognised that he had to grade papers, but she was still annoyed. Lack of accountability for behaviour, absence of emotional empathy. I'm like, why didn't he do the grading earlier today, she said. I bet there was lots of time today when he was wasting time. Prejudicial. That's probably true, Arnold said. We sat at the kitchen table and he dipped the pita into hummus he had just blended. The boys were at the Mall with his parents. Also, the thing with the coughing and the sneezing is funny because you're clearly suffering in a pretty serious way, he told Agnes. You have been for days. And at this point, I've just faded it out, I just don't hear it anymore. Agnes said that in moments of disconnection she repeats a little mantra to herself. It's fine, you can do this on your own. You can figure things out on your own. But she knows it's a lie. I almost have a feeling of pleasure, like a sick pleasure, as I placate myself with the thought, she told me. I asked Agnes and Arnold if they still felt that their relationship gave them the capacity for radical transformation, as Agnes had told her students. I think there was something right in that vision, Agnes said. Magical thinking, but it has been so much harder than I thought it would be. To change, but also just to be in love, to relate in a really loving way to another person. It's like once you start trying to do that, you come up with against all of your limits. In her marriage with Ben, she hadn't been aspiring toward any particular ideal, so her flaws didn't feel as painful. Cerebral approach. I think I never realised how fundamentally selfish, narcissistic trait I was before I met Arnold, she said. I'm just really not able to be much less selfish than I am. Arnold said he never expected that he'd become a new person. For me, it was more like meeting Agnes was the experience of finally not going to waste. Nothing about you changed, but you became oriented towards what was important in some way, Agnes explained. Their marriage had ended up being more asymmetrical than they had expected. Your entire philosophical career is a discussion of our marriage in one way or another, Arnold said. Lack of accountability, sense of entitlement. Agnes agreed. If their marriage was a kind of play, she was the central character, and the author too. Assertion of control, self-absorption, sense of entitlement. A common refrain in their fights, argumentativeness, form of manipulation, nullification of threat to control, assertion of control, was whether Arnold, who became an assistant professor in 2021, should aspire to more. Agnes felt that he could write an extraordinary book about Aristotle, but he was content to read the text and share his interpretations with his students. Arnold fundamentally sees life as, like you're supposed to find a place of contentment, she said. And his way of doing things often shows up to me as, he's not working hard enough, belittlement, and invalidation. And my way of doing things often shows up to him as, she's incapable of being happy, which of course she is as a narcissist. Arnold clarified, the source of my question is, what is the aim of work? It has to be something that's not work. Aspiration can't be infinite, as much as you would love it to be, because at some point you have to get to the value that you are supposed to be aspiring towards, and once you're there, that's who you are. Agnes had just finished a draft of her second book, Cerebral Activity, which fills in what she considers to be a significant omission in her first book, the degree to which aspiration depends on other people. The book examines the ways in which Socrates recognized our vulnerability and neediness and incompleteness. His greatest insight, Agnes believes, was that people are intellectually lonely. Cerebral approach, they live under an illusion of self-sufficiency. Dialogue was the only way out of their natural state. And yet the people who took up Socrates' work, developed the field of philosophy, struggled to keep that insight in view. They went off and came up with theories on their own. Perhaps they thought that Socrates secretly possessed his insights all along, that he didn't need other people to answer his question, an assumption that Agnes thinks is misguided. He was not doing this from a position of strength, she said. One chapter of the book is about Socratic love, and it builds on the talk Agnes gave her students in 2011 when she first fell in love with Arnold. She repeats the argument she made about Socrates' vision of love as a kind of ladder, two lovers aspiring together to the same ideals, but she also contemplates what it means when the company of the person she once chased with breathless abandon loses its thrill, the frequency of both sex and vigorous conversation decreases, and living together becomes a matter of routine. The supposedly good case is in its own way also far from ideal. Cerebral approach, narcissistic dynamic. As their youngest son grew older and there were fewer urgent distractions, Agnes became aware that marriage is a thing that can die. She described the experience as persistently ignoring the thought that there's something wrong. You just turn away from something, and then keep turning away from it, and eventually you can't see it anymore. Her parents, who emigrated from Hungary when she was 4, were united by a shared sense of struggle. They were trying to adapt to a new culture with little money or command of the language. The structure of marriage suited them well. Agnes felt that she had imported the conventional trappings of marriage without evaluating which features remained relevant. She worried, she said, that she and Arnold were losing the spirit of marriage for the sake of the convention. They laboured under the shadow of the transcendence of their early romance. I'll be like, why can't we get back to that? Agnes said, return to golden period. And Arnold will be like, that was never there. He is offended by my attempt to go back in time. And I feel like he is taking away the foundation of our relationship and telling me that our lives are built on a lie. Of course, Arnold's accurate in that respect, but it's a threat to her sense of control. After 7 years of marriage, they watch Ingmar Bergman's Scenes from a Marriage, a portrait of a couple as they struggle to understand the limits and possibilities of their relationship in the course of a decade. It's extraordinary that two people can live a whole life together without, the wife's mother says, without touching. The wife answers. The couple divorce, but their relationship continues, without the distance and artifice that marked their marriage. The ending is not widely viewed as a happy one. Agnes is planning to write her next book about the show, Cerebral Activity, as well as about what she calls her philosophical marriage. The show clarified her feelings of estrangement. Until she met Arnold, she said, I didn't realise how lonely I was. You don't see it. It's like the air that you breathe, but when you see that you can be relieved of it, there is this weird way in which the relationship exacerbates the loneliness. For Agnes, loneliness was the experience of having thought she wanted to communicate, but felt unable to do so. Pity play, because she knew that her words would come out wrong or be misinterpreted. Whatever she said would be a distortion of what she was feeling. And that experience is almost a kind of madness, the experience of not being able to settle on a view about how anything is. Marriage is an institution committed to the dullness of the feelings, Susan Sontag once wrote. The whole point of marriage is repetition. Agnes and Arnold felt that they had entered marriage without clearly thinking through what the institution was actually for. For many couples, marriage ends up about being a family, and when it fails to meet other needs, the couple lovingly and generously let it fail. But Agnes was uncomfortable with the prospect of a relationship that had lost its aspirational character. She wondered what it would look like if she and Arnold integrated new romantic relationships into their marriage. Lack of boundary recognition, sense of entitlement. They would all keep talking about philosophy, cerebral approach, but with fresh ideas in the mix. They asked each other whether it would violate the terms of their marriage if they became romantically involved with other people. We didn't think there was any good reason other than the usual conventions of marriage to answer that question with a yes, she said. They referred to their new agreement as the variation. Agnes was struck by how bound by convention she'd been when she divorced Ben, threat to control. I was almost saying something like, look, I love my husband for this other man, but he's the one person, the one and only person, and I promise I won't do it again. It was as if she had been unconsciously trying to justify a kind of social dogma that you can love only one person at a time. After our conversation in Pennsylvania, Agnes said Arnold worried that they'd given me the impression that their marriage was a success story. At the time, I had expressed that if cooking pita alone felt tragic, then things seemed to be going well, but I perhaps overlooked the way that tiny kitchen conflicts can expose relationship fault lines that feel elemental. When we talked again, I asked them about the ways in which they weren't as happy as they appeared to be. They spoke to me on Zoom from Agnes's office, and when she had turned into a kind of magical kindergarten, bright stars, circular mirrors and LED lights hung from ropes wrapped in yarn of different colours, cerebral approach, the walls were covered in fabrics, featuring flowery blobs, the table had large polka dots. It's not like this thing that we do, which is constantly talk about philosophy, as a happy activity, Arnold told me. It's just as difficult and problematic and fraught an activity as what I take it many couples would do together. I guess I would go even a little further than Arnold in saying that this territory is pretty often painful, Agnes said. She was sitting at her desk wearing a pink dress with large llamas on it. Arnold had pulled up a chair beside her. There are certain reliable circumstances that will make it non-painful, she went on. I can tell you exactly what they are. It's when Arnold is explaining Aristotle to me. She felt that no one could explain anything as well as he explained Aristotle. Flattery. He was always patient, never defensive. His interpretations weren't tied up in his own ego. The way we first got together was by talking about Aristotle, she said, cerebral approach, and yet I just thought, well, yeah, but that was incidental. I could have been teaching a class on anything. It turns out, no, it was really important that it was Aristotle, cerebral approach. In her marriage with Ben, Agnes had never wondered whether the relationship was going okay, but with Arnold she said, we've often had the kind of stress and struggle of like, is this working? She continued, in that way, it's a less happy relationship than the one I had with Ben. She added that when she and Arnold fought, argumentativeness, form of assertion of control, rejection of threat to control, they could rely on Ben to provide an objective perspective. He would try to think through the problem from both of their points of view, rather than reflexively offering validation. The phrase coming to mind is immaculate divorce, I said. A divorce without grief or sorrow or pain. Magical thinking. I actually think that's a pretty good description, Agnes said. She'd been taking notes throughout the conversation and wrote something down, cerebral approach. This has come up in conversations when we've had dark moments, and Arnold is luck. If we have to get divorced, we'll do it correctly. No one would feel trapped morally or practically. She imagined marriage as a bundle of services, along with love, the security, friendship, child rearing, financial support and assistance with one's work. Arnold is sort of saying, look, we can unbundle it. Marriage has a lot of stuff packed into it. But if you knew what job each bit was doing, then if you lose the marriage, you could still potentially reconstitute the bits, she added. The only barrier to our getting divorced is our wanting to continue to be married. In an episode of Scenes from a Marriage, the wife comes to ask the husband to sign divorce papers, and he, realising that he's bound to the marriage in a deeper way than he'd known, locks his wife in his office and then strikes her in the face. Agnes and Arnold's marriage was set up so that no one would ever feel locked in. But Arnold also identified with the husband's blind panic at the prospect of losing the relationship that has given his life meaning. It's not that we live without that feeling, he said, it's that we are trying to manage that feeling. So it's like we're always breaking up, Agnes asked. No, it's like the philosophy as a preparation for death thing, he said, quoting one of Socrates' most famous lines. Maybe our marriage is preparation for divorce, cerebral approach. The thing we're trying to do is approach that fact, that another person could be so deeply tied to the meaning of your life that without the relationship, life might feel meaningless. I think a lot of our fights, argumentativeness, assertion of control, nullification of threat to control, boil down to Arnold thinking he's already arrived at the final condition where he doesn't need me anymore, threat to control, Agnes said, and me trying to point out to him that he's not as great as he thinks he is, invalidation, belittlement, assertion of control, so that he can see that he still actually does need me. Arnold smiled slightly, his eyes cast down. And that, actually, is a way of understanding how marriage is a preparation for divorce, Agnes went on. It's a preparation for the time when you won't need another person in order to think. It's this idea that we want marriage to have a point, Arnold said. People talk about the aim of their careers, but they don't use that sort of vocabulary for marriage. When Socrates says that philosophy is a preparation for death, he's very clear that he doesn't mean you're supposed to commit suicide. It's just that there's some way in which philosophy could stand up to the task of making you able to deal with death when it comes. The corresponding claim, Agnes said, would be that somehow the project of marriage would make you capable of being alone. Sometimes when Agnes discusses her marriage with Yelena Baraz, her best friend, Baraz gets frustrated by her philosophical approach, cerebral approach. Agnes said, I'm like, okay, what is jealousy? Am I entitled to feel it? Is there something I'm getting right in feeling this way? Baraz wants to comfort her. I feel like she's treating herself as a guinea pig or a case study, Baraz told me, and I want to relate to her as a person I care about who is in distress. But Agnes is impatient, lack of patience, lack of accountability, haughtiness, with the let's get through the next 15 minutes kind of approach. The way I think about it is, there's no other time when you could understand this thing. Devastating problems in your life can also be interesting, and they can interest you as they're happening to you and as they're causing you intense pain. Agnes eventually wants to write about unconventional family arrangements like hers, relationship bulletin, cerebral approach, but she's also noticed that when people write about such topics, they're both celebratory and defensive, as if they're trying to put a good face on it. She doesn't want to draw conclusions until she can grasp the real thing in all its tragic splendour, she told me. When I asked about the nature of the tragedy, she sent me a list of 16 points. However many people you have, it is never enough, was the first point on the list: sense of entitlement, lack of emotional empathy. One is not enough. Narcissistic dynamic. This is part of the tragedy of monogamy, but neither is two or three. She went on to describe how differently she and Ben and Arnold dealt with their fears of aging and death, threats to control, and their unspoken wishes for their children. The realization that honesty is often brutal and intolerable, the understanding that passion is unsustainable. She felt as if she were constantly trying to open their eyes to the tragic aspects of their lives, and they weren't seeing it. There was also the problem of equilibrium. Each relationship settles into its own patterns, a set of interlocking arrangements based on each person's insecurities and needs, which becomes nearly impossible to alter, even more so among three. So many things let go of, she wrote, rather than really resolved. I asked Agnes if there was a version of aspiration that takes the form of becoming a person who accepts what is good enough. Life is fragile and terrifying, and so much of it can be taken away. Can you aspire to know how to fully inhabit a relationship, a life that feels like a plateau? Cerebral approach. I think grateful acceptance can be loving, but I think exciting demands can also be loving, she responds in an email. Marriage has an amazing PR team for 2 decades. It's been continuously telling me, this is good, this is how it's supposed to be, this should count as enough, lots of people don't get enough this much, you shouldn't accept this and move on to other concerns. And I feel increasingly emboldened to say, no thanks, I'd rather keep working and searching and striving. Thus, this interview from The New Yorker gives you an understanding of the various narcissistic traits of the relevant individual, the various indicators which demonstrate that they're a narcissist, but also the way that a cerebral narcissist both behaves but also sees the nature of their relationship. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.